the weight of the rope. The rope stretched 68 feet down the face of Hacksaw Ridge, disappearing into the Okinawan darkness below, where medics waited with empty stretchers. Desmond Doss wrapped another turn around the charred tree stump that served as his anchor point, testing the knot one more time before lowering Private Chen's unconscious form over the cliff edge. Rain had been falling since midnight, making the coral limestones slick as ice, and the improvised stretcher, assembled from rifle stocks and a torn shelter half, swayed dangerously in the wind that swept across the ridge. Behind him, scattered across the plateau's cratered surface, at least 12 more wounded soldiers lay where they had fallen during the morning's failed assault. The 77th Infantry Division had taken the ridge 3 days earlier, but Japanese positions, carved deep into the coral bedrock, continued to pour machine gun fire across any movement above ground. What should have been a routine consolidation had become a death trap when concealed mortars began dropping shells with surgical precision onto every American position. The order to withdraw had crackled over the radio 2 hours ago. Most of the able-bodied men had already rappelled down the cargo nets to regroup in the valley below, leaving only the dead and wounded scattered across the exposed plateau. Standard operating procedure called for medics to evacuate with the walking wounded, but Doss could still hear voices calling weakly from shell craters and collapsed bunkers. Men who had been lying in the open since dawn, waiting for help that might never come. "Chen's breathing is getting worse," Sergeant Martinez had told him before descending with the last squad. "You need to get him down there fast, or we're going to lose him." But Chen was just one of 13, maybe more. In the smoke and confusion of the withdrawal, exact casualty counts had become impossible to maintain. Doss knew that Kowalski lay somewhere near the destroyed observation post with shrapnel wounds to both legs. Morrison had been calling for help from a crater 50 yards beyond the tree line until his voice had faded to whispers around 10 o'clock. And there were others, glimpses of torn uniforms and motionless forms that he had spotted during his trips across the plateau but hadn't yet reached. The rope itself had become his lifeline to salvation, fashioned from cargo netting, communications wire, and strips torn from ponchos and shelter halves. Each strand represented another life that could be saved, another telegram that wouldn't be sent to a family back home. But the improvised line was already showing dangerous wear at the anchor point, several strands beginning to fray from repeated use and the constant friction against the coral edge of the cliff. As Chen's stretcher reached bottom and hands pulled him toward the aid station, Doss heard movement in the tunnel system below the ridge. Japanese voices echoed from hidden positions, suggesting that enemy soldiers were already moving to reoccupy the plateau once the last Americans departed. Radio calls from the valley grew increasingly urgent, officers demanding to know his position, medics shouting for him to abandon the ridge before Japanese reinforcements cut off his only escape route. "Doss!" Lieutenant Williams's voice crackled through the field telephone that someone had left connected near the cliff edge. "Get down here now! We're pulling back to secondary positions." But somewhere in the darkness behind him, Morrison's voice had started up again, weak and desperate, calling medic, with the kind of desperation that meant shock was setting in and time was running out. Doss looked at the rope, then at the scattered forms visible in the dim starlight across the plateau. 13 men, maybe more, and a fraying line that might hold for another dozen trips if he was careful, if the anchor point didn't fail, if Japanese mortars didn't find the range first. He wrapped the rope around his waist, said a quiet prayer, and started crawling back toward Morrison's voice. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The crawl back to Morrison's position took 23 minutes of careful movement through shell craters and around the broken stumps of trees that had been shattered by 3 days of continuous bombardment. The plateau of Hacksaw Ridge stretched nearly 200 yards from the cliff edge to the tree line, every yard of it exposed to observation from Japanese positions that seemed to shift and multiply with each passing hour. What had looked like light defensive positions during the morning assault had revealed itself as an elaborate network of interconnected caves and tunnels carved deep into the Okinawan coral. DOS moved in short bursts, using bomb craters and fallen logs for cover, listening carefully for the sound of movement in the tunnels below. The rain that had been falling since midnight muffled sound, but also made the ground treacherous, turning the coral dust into a slippery paste that made every step uncertain. His medical bag, reduced now to a handful of bandages and 2 morphine syrettes, bounced quietly against his hip as he crawled forward through the mud. "Medic," Morrison called weakly when DOS finally reached the crater where the private had been lying for nearly 14 hours. I thought everyone had left." Morrison's legs were torn by shrapnel from a mortar burst that had caught him in the open during the initial withdrawal. Blood loss had left him delirious and shivering, despite the warm rain that continued to fall across the ridge. DOS applied pressure dressings and a tourniquet made from bootlaces, working by feel in the darkness while listening for signs of Japanese movement. The nearest enemy positions seemed to be about 70 yards away, marked by occasional muzzle flashes and the echo of voices in the tunnel system below. "Why didn't you go down with the others?" Morrison whispered as DOS secured him to the improvised stretcher. "Because you were still up here." The return trip to the rope took even longer, with Morrison's weight making movement slow and awkward. Twice they had to freeze motionless in shell craters while Japanese patrols passed within 30 yards, their voices and footsteps clearly audible in the darkness. DOS found himself holding his breath until his lungs burned, one hand pressed over Morrison's mouth to prevent any sound that might give away their position. At the cliff edge, the rope showed additional fraying where it had been rubbing against the coral during Chen's descent. DOS spent precious minutes in the darkness, retying knots with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline. The anchor point around the burned tree stump remained solid, but the line itself was beginning to stretch under repeated use, making the descent longer and more precarious with each trip. Morrison's evacuation went smoothly until the stretcher was halfway down, when a sudden gust of wind off the Pacific Ocean set it spinning. The private's instinctive grab for the side rails probably saved his life, preventing a fall onto the rocks that jutted from the base of the cliff. Voices from the aid station below confirmed that he had reached bottom safely, but DOS could hear the exhaustion in the medics' voices as they carried another wounded man toward the waiting vehicles. "How many more?" someone called up from the darkness below. DOS looked back across the plateau. Kowalski's voice had gone silent around 11 o'clock, but the sergeant might still be alive near the observation post. Phillips, the machine gunner, had been spotted lying motionless near a destroyed ammunition cache. And there were others, forms and voices he had glimpsed during his trips across the ridge but hadn't yet reached. The exact count remained uncertain in the smoke and confusion, but at least 10 more wounded Americans lay scattered across the exposed ground. The rope, when he tested it again, felt different in his hands, thinner, more alive somehow as individual strands began to separate under the constant stress. The cargo netting that formed its core was military surplus, designed for loading ships and trucks, not for repeated human evacuations down a cliff face. He estimated it might hold for 8 or 10 more descents before the anchor point failed entirely. 8 or 10 more chances to pull someone back from the killing field above. From somewhere in the tunnel system below the ridge, Japanese voices were growing louder and more frequent. Dawn was still 4 hours away, but enemy soldiers were already moving to reoccupy the positions that the Americans had abandoned. Time was running out for the wounded men scattered across the plateau and for the medic with no weapon who refused to leave them behind. DOS wrapped the rope around his waist again and started crawling toward the sound of Kowalski's last known position. Sergeant Kowalski lay unconscious beside the ruins of the observation post, his breathing shallow and irregular after more than 15 hours exposed to the elements on Hacksaw Ridge. Gangrene was already visible around a tourniquet that had been applied too tightly during the morning's confusion, and his pulse felt weak and thready under Doss's fingertips. The sergeant had been hit by multiple fragments from a mortar burst that had collapsed the makeshift bunker, leaving him pinned beneath communications equipment and scattered sandbags. The journey back to the rope required 47 minutes of careful movement, with frequent stops to check Kowalski's vital signs and adjust the field dressings that were all Doss had left in his depleted medical kit. Halfway across the plateau, a Japanese patrol passed within 15 yards of their position, forcing both Americans to lie motionless in a shell crater while enemy soldiers swept the area with bayonets and grenades. Doss pressed his hand over Kowalski's mouth to muffle the sergeant's labored breathing, counting heartbeats until the patrol moved on toward the western edge of the ridge. In the aid station below, Dr. Winnick worked by the light of shielded lanterns under a canvas tarp stretched between two jeeps. 19 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers around him, the result of 3 days of fighting on Okinawa and the night's evacuations from the ridge above. Morphine was running low, and the nearest field hospital was 40 minutes away by rough mountain roads that came under sniper fire after dawn. Each man that Doss lowered on the fraying rope represented another impossible decision about who could be saved and who would have to wait. "That medic is still up there," Corporal Davis reported as he helped carry Kowalski's stretcher away from the cliff base. "Lieutenant Williams wants to know if we should send up another squad to bring him down." "Negative," Dr. Winnick replied without looking up from the chest wound he was treating. "Nobody else goes up that ridge tonight. One man moving alone has a chance. A squad would draw every mortar on the island. The rope, when Doss tested it for Kowalski's descent, felt noticeably different under his hands. What had started the evening as a solid line capable of supporting 200 pounds now showed dangerous wear at multiple stress points. The anchor knot around the burned tree stump remained secure, but individual strands of cargo netting were beginning to snap under the repeated load of human evacuations. He estimated 6 more descents before the line failed entirely, 6 more chances to save the men scattered across the plateau behind him. Phillips, the machine gunner, still lay somewhere near the destroyed ammunition cache. 2 other soldiers, identities unknown in the darkness, had been spotted earlier near collapsed foxholes on the eastern slope. And there might be others, wounded men who had crawled into the deepest craters or behind the largest pieces of debris, waiting silently for help that everyone else assumed would never come. Radio traffic from below carried increasingly urgent reports from other sectors of the Okinawan campaign. Japanese counterattacks were developing along multiple fronts, and the 77th Infantry Division was being pressured to consolidate its positions before dawn. The ridge that Doss continued to climb represented just one small piece of a larger battle that had been raging for weeks. But for the wounded men scattered across its coral surface, it was the entire world. "Doss!" Lieutenant Williams's voice crackled again through the field telephone. "Battalion wants a final casualty count from your position. How many more are up there?" Doss looked back across the plateau, trying to count forms and voices in the darkness. The honest answer was that he didn't know. Smoke, confusion, and the constant threat of enemy fire had made accurate tallies impossible since the withdrawal began. Some of the motionless forms he had spotted might already be dead. Others might be Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated the American positions, but as long as he could hear voices calling "Medic!" from the craters and collapsed bunkers, he would continue crawling toward them. "At least 6 more," he called back. "Maybe 8. "Negative." The lieutenant's voice carried a note of finality. "You've got 1 hour to get yourself down from there. After that, we're pulling back to secondary positions whether you're with us or not. 1 hour, 6 more wounded soldiers, and a rope that might not hold for 6 more evacuations down the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge." Doss wrapped the line around his waist, said another quiet prayer, and started crawling toward Phillips's last known position. Behind him, Japanese voices echoed from the tunnel system with increasing frequency, suggesting that enemy reinforcements were already moving to reoccupy the plateau once the last American departed. The weight of the rope seemed heavier now, as if each strand carried not just the promise of salvation, but the accumulated fear and hope of every man he had already lowered into the darkness below. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Phillips lay beneath the twisted remains of a destroyed ammunition cache, conscious but fading fast from a sucking chest wound that had been bleeding for 16 hours. The machine gunner's breathing came in short, wet gasps that Doss recognized as the sound of lungs filling with blood. There was no time for elaborate field treatment, only enough to seal the wound with the last pressure dressing in his medical kit and secure Phillips to the stretcher before shock claimed him entirely. "I knew you'd come back," Phillips whispered as Doss worked. "Morrison said you got him down safe." The return journey to the cliff edge took 39 minutes through increasingly dangerous terrain. Japanese infiltrators were now moving freely through the tunnel system below the ridge, and twice Doss heard enemy soldiers passing within 20 feet of their position. The stretcher, weakened by repeated use, and Phillips's thrashing movements, began to come apart at the joints where rifle stocks met torn canvas. Only field expedients, bootlaces, wire, and strips torn from Doss's own uniform held it together long enough to reach the rope. At the cliff edge, the line showed critical damage. 3 major strands of the cargo netting had snapped during Kowalski's descent, leaving the rope's core strength dependent on communications wire and improvised knots that were never intended to support human weight. When Doss tested the anchor point, he could feel individual fibers separating under stress. The burned tree stump that served as his anchor remained solid, but the rope itself was dying strand by strand. Phillips's descent became a nightmare of mechanical failure and desperate improvisation. Halfway down the cliff face, the stretcher's left rail cracked with a sound like a gunshot, tilting Phillips at a dangerous angle that threatened to dump him onto the coral rocks below. Only the machine gunner's instinctive grip on the side supports prevented a fatal fall, while Doss worked frantically above to adjust the rope's tension and stabilize the stretcher's angle of descent. "The rope's breaking!" someone called from the aid station below. "Get him down fast!" Individual strands continued to snap under the load, each failure marked by a sharp crack that echoed off the cliff face. Doss felt the line stretch and thin in his hands as he lowered Phillips foot by foot toward the waiting medics. By the time the stretcher reached bottom, nearly half the rope's original strength had been lost to fatigue and repeated stress. What remained might hold for 3 or 4 more evacuations before failing entirely. Below in the aid station, Dr. Winnick looked up from Phillips' chest wound with exhaustion written across his face. 22 wounded soldiers now lay on stretchers under the canvas tarp, more casualties than his small unit was equipped to handle. Medical supplies were critically low, and transportation to the field hospital had been suspended after Japanese mortars found the range on the mountain road. "That's it," he told Corporal Davis quietly. "Tell that medic up there he's done enough. The rope won't hold for another descent, and we can't handle any more casualties anyway." But Doss could still hear voices calling from the plateau behind him. At least 4 more wounded soldiers scattered across the crater-scarred surface of Hacksaw Ridge. The exact locations remained uncertain in the darkness, but he had spotted movement near collapsed foxholes and heard weak calls for help from areas he hadn't yet reached. Time was running out as Japanese forces continued to infiltrate the American positions, but the mathematical reality was inescapable. 4 more lives hung in the balance. The rope, when he tested it again, felt like a living thing in his hands, stretching and creaking under stress, individual strands separating with small pops that sounded like breaking bones. The cargo netting that formed its core was designed for loading equipment, not for the repeated human evacuations that had been demanded of it throughout the night. Engineering principles suggested it should have failed hours ago, yet somehow it continued to hold together through increasingly desperate improvisations. "DOS!" Lieutenant Williams's voice carried across the darkness with final authority. "You've got 15 minutes. After that, we're destroying the rope and pulling back. 15 minutes, 4 more wounded soldiers, and a line that might snap under the weight of a single additional evacuation." DOS looked at the rope, then at the scattered forms visible across the plateau. He thought about the families back home who would receive telegrams if he failed, about the wounded men who had already trusted their lives to his improvised equipment and stubborn faith. The weight of the line in his hands seemed to carry all of it. Every life saved, every prayer whispered in the darkness, every decision to keep crawling forward when everyone else had stopped. He wrapped the rope around his waist one more time and started moving toward the nearest voice calling for help. Behind him, Japanese soldiers were already beginning to emerge from the tunnel system, their silhouettes visible against the faint starlight that filtered through the smoke and rain clouds above Okinawa. The mathematics of salvation had been reduced to its simplest terms. 4 more lives against the breaking strength of improvised fibers, measured out foot by foot in the darkness above a cliff that had already claimed too many American lives. The central secret that Desmond Doss would never include in his official testimony was how completely he had broken down during the evacuation of the 26th wounded soldier. It happened while lowering Private Jackson, a 19-year-old rifleman from Ohio whose legs had been shattered by mortar fire. Halfway through the descent, when 3 more strands of the rope snapped simultaneously and Jackson's stretcher lurched toward the cliff face, Doss found himself sobbing uncontrollably while working to stabilize the line. The breakdown lasted perhaps 90 seconds, a moment of absolute terror and exhaustion that he would edit from every retelling of that night on Hacksaw Ridge. The rope held, Jackson reached bottom alive, but Doss spent several minutes crouched at the cliff edge, shaking so violently that he couldn't trust his hands to work the knots properly. The accumulation of 17 hours under fire, 36 separate trips across the exposed plateau, and the growing certainty that the rope would eventually fail had finally overwhelmed his capacity to simply continue. "Dear Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." What sustained him through that moment wasn't divine intervention or heroic determination, but the purely mechanical sound of someone calling medic from a crater near the eastern slope. The voice belonged to Private First Class Rodriguez, wounded in both arms and unable to crawl to safety. Training and habit pulled Doss back to his feet before faith or courage could reassert themselves. He moved toward Rodriguez's position because stopping would have required a conscious decision, and that was beyond his capacity to make. The evacuation of Rodriguez revealed the rope's final limitations. Only a handful of cargo net strands remained intact, supplemented by communications wire and strips of canvas that were never intended to support human weight. The line had stretched nearly 6 feet beyond its original length, making the descent longer and more dangerous with each trip. When Rodriguez reached bottom, Dr. Winnick sent up word through the field telephone that no more casualties could be accepted. The aid station was overwhelmed, medical supplies were exhausted, and transportation to the field hospital remained suspended. But 2 more voices still called from the darkness: Corporal Stevens, near the collapsed observation post, and an unidentified soldier whose calls for help echoed from somewhere beyond the tree line. Doss calculated that the rope might hold for 1 more evacuation, possibly 2 if he was willing to risk everything on equipment that defied all reasonable engineering principles. The mathematical certainty was that at least one wounded soldier would be left behind when the line finally failed. The choice of who to save last became the night's cruelest decision. Stevens was closer and easier to reach, but his wounds appeared less severe than those of the unknown soldier, whose voice carried the desperation of someone sliding into shock. Standard triage protocols suggested prioritizing the more critically injured patient, but the practical reality was that attempting to reach the tree line might use up the time needed to evacuate both men. Doss crawled towards Stevens's position, telling himself that he would have time to reach the other wounded soldier afterward. But the evacuation of Stevens consumed the rope's last reserves of strength. The line held just long enough to lower the corporal to safety before snapping completely at the anchor point, leaving 20 feet of useless cable draped over the cliff edge like a monument to mechanical failure. In the sudden silence that followed the rope's destruction, the voice from beyond the tree line called out one final time before falling silent. Doss never learned the identity of that last wounded soldier, never discovered whether he died from his wounds or was captured when Japanese forces reoccupied the plateau. The uncertainty would follow him through 40 years of nightmares and flashbacks, a reminder that even extraordinary courage had mathematical limits. "Doss!" Lieutenant Williams's voice carried finality across the darkness. "The rope's gone! Get yourself down here now!" The descent without rope required 43 minutes of careful work along handholds carved into the coral face of the cliff. Doss reached bottom just as Japanese mortars began falling on the abandoned plateau above, confirming that enemy forces had indeed reoccupied the ridge. 29 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in the aid station behind him, lives saved through improvised equipment and stubborn faith, measured against the one voice that had called for help until the mathematics of salvation failed. In the official after-action report, the events on Hacksaw Ridge would be compressed into 3 clean sentences. Private Doss evacuated approximately 30 wounded personnel under enemy fire. Evacuation conducted using improvised rope and stretcher equipment. No American casualties left on Ridge. The uncertainty about the final wounded soldier would disappear into the bureaucratic need for definitive numbers, leaving only the legend of miraculous courage and mechanical impossibility. But Doss would carry the weight of that unknown voice for the rest of his life, a reminder that behind every citation lay human decisions with permanent consequences, and that the stories people chose to tell were always lighter than the memories they chose to carry in silence. 3 months after Hacksaw Ridge, Corporal Davis found Doss sitting alone outside the field hospital on Saipan, staring at a coil of new rope that had been delivered with the morning's supply shipment. The rope was military specification cargo line, clean, strong, and precisely engineered for its intended load capacity. Nothing like the improvised collection of cable, netting, and canvas strips that had saved 29 lives on an Okinawan cliff face. "Looks different when it's new," Davis observed, settling onto an ammunition crate beside the medic who had become something of a legend throughout the Pacific theater. Doss nodded without speaking. He had been having trouble with his hands since the ridge, a tremor that appeared whenever he worked with rope or cable, as if his muscles retained the memory of fibers separating under impossible stress. Medical evaluation had found nothing wrong, but the trembling continued whenever he touched anything that reminded him of that night on Hacksaw Ridge. The official citation had reached him 2 weeks earlier, clean military language that transformed 17 hours of terror and improvisation into heroic narrative. According to the paperwork, he had courageously evacuated wounded personnel while under intense enemy fire, demonstrating extraordinary devotion to duty and saving approximately 30 American lives. The citation made no mention of the rope's near failures, his breakdown during Jackson's evacuation, or the voice that had called for help until the line finally snapped. "They want me to go back to the States," Doss told Davis quietly. "Speaking tour. War bond rallies. Tell people about what happened up there. You going to do it? Doss looked at the new rope, thinking about the mathematics of storytelling versus the weight of actual memory. The rope that had saved 29 lives had been destroyed in the saving, leaving only the stories people chose to tell about impossible courage and divine intervention. But he could still hear the voice from beyond the tree line, still felt the individual strands separating under his hands, still woke some nights with the sound of Phillips's labored breathing echoing in his dreams. "I don't know how to tell them what it was really like," he admitted. "How do you explain being that scared and still keeping going? How do you talk about the one we didn't get?" Davis was quiet for several minutes, watching medical orderlies carry supplies between the hospital tents. The war in the Pacific continued around them, but at a different pace now, more methodical, less desperate than the fighting on Okinawa had been. The ridge itself had been secured permanently after 2 more weeks of fighting, its coral cave sealed and its strategic value finally realized. But for the men who had been there that night, Hacksaw Ridge remained a place measured in the strength of improvised fibers and the weight of decisions made in darkness. "Maybe you tell them about the rope," Davis suggested. "Not the heroic stuff, the way it felt in your hands, how it kept holding together when it shouldn't have, how everything depended on knots tied by someone who didn't really know what he was doing." The speaking tour, when it came, would indeed focus on the rope, though not in the way Davis had suggested. Audiences wanted to hear about miraculous salvation and divine intervention, about courage that transcended human limitations and faith that moved mountains. They were less interested in the mechanical reality of cargo netting under stress or the uncertainty that had surrounded every evacuation. The story grew cleaner and more heroic with each telling, until even Doss began to question his own memories of breakdown and doubt. But in private moments, usually triggered by the smell of wet canvas or the sound of rain on a tin roof, the weight of that night would return with complete clarity. He would remember the exact texture of fraying cable against his palms, the sound of Phillips's breathing, the voice from beyond the tree line that had called for help until the mathematics of salvation failed. The official story spoke of 30 lives saved through extraordinary courage. The private memory carried the weight of improvised decisions made by a terrified young man who had refused to leave the ridge until the rope itself made the choice for him. Years later, when well-meaning strangers would thank him for his service and ask about the famous night on Hacksaw Ridge, Doss would give them the clean version, the story of faith and determination that people needed to hear. But sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he would find himself calculating load factors and stress points, wondering if a better rope or different knots might have saved one more life from the darkness above an Okinawan cliff. The weight of the rope, it turned out, was not something you left behind when you descended the cliff. It was something you carried forward, measured not in pounds or engineering specifications, but in the accumulated weight of every decision made in darkness, every voice that called for help, and every strand of fiber that held together just long enough to matter. In the end, that weight proved more durable than any medal or citation, a reminder that the stories people chose to tell were always lighter than the memories they chose to carry, and that the real cost of courage was not measured in moments of heroic action, but in the decades of silence that followed. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.